Okay, hello. This is an illustration of a use case of AutoPilot M6 transaction works, transactional monitoring. And we'll start this off by looking at a business view that contains information, contains sensors that show us how well my transactions are performing compared to their established SLAs. So within this view, we're seeing a certain number of transaction groups. For example, trade verification enrichment, trade tracking, forex trading, or payments. And what we're seeing in each one of these sensors is the average duration of the transactions within that transaction group in milliseconds compared to the maximum allowable duration of the transaction as defined by the SLA. So naturally, if any transaction within these transaction groups is not performing well, if there's transaction latency, if transactions are slow, if for any reason transactions are unavailable, that's going to have consequences. And one of the first consequences we see, as illustrated by this sensor in the upper right, marked service level agreement, is that there will be an SLA breach. And more importantly, in instances where transactions are latent or unavailable, there will be a business impact. And that's shown here by these two sensors, trading volume and trading value. So if our transactions are not performing as expected, within this illustration for FineCorp Investor Services, we're going to see a lower volume of trades and, most importantly, a lower trading value. So if we want to know more about why transactions aren't performing well, one thing we could do is click down here on our Application Performance Monitoring dashboard. Now if we do that with a click right and open link target, we come to this business view, which shows us for each transaction group the components that are involved in the application architecture. So for example, for the top level trading transaction group, we're seeing within this application architecture we have WebSphere Application Server, WebSphere MQ, Microsoft.NET, SAP, and CICS. And similar options are used within this business view for other transaction groups such as Forex or equities, for example. So if we wanted to, we could drill down further to see the details of these sensors. For example, here noticing that WMQ sensor is suddenly red, we could drill down here, again using open link target, and we would come here to our trade queue view sensor, which is monitoring the queues that are used by the trading application. So one of the things that we note here is that the trade audit input queue is frequently reaching its maximum depth. So once we've done this, once we've ascertained that we do have issues somewhere within our application infrastructure that's having an impact on transactions, we might want to look more closely at what is happening within these transactions. So by clicking on any one of these sensors, we're doing a link to transactions. And once I click on transactions, we'll see the AutoPilot Transaction Works Explorer that's shown here with an automatic login. And I'm confronted with the summary view. Now the summary view tab here shows me overall transaction processing metrics for the selected transaction group. And you see here the trade verification transaction group is the one that's selected. Now on the top panel, what I see is the total transaction volume. That shows me for the given time slice, which is a 5-minute period, I'm looking at 10 intervals of 5 minutes, a certain number of transactions, some of which are complete. Here I have 18 completed transactions with this time interval. Others which may be failed, which may be in progress, or which may have missed their SLAs. So I'm going to select this one here, 18 completed transactions within this time interval, and by clicking left and selecting statistics, I will see the statistics view, which shows me the transaction volume for a selected period of time. So in the graphic at the top, what we're seeing here is the number of transactions that were executed within a selected time interval. So here I'm seeing different transactions executed within this interval of time, which is today's date, between 11:15 and 11:20. So within this 5-minute interval, these are the transactions that were executed. Now, at the bottom part of the screen, what I'm seeing is a number of pie charts. Now, these pie charts are showing me the percent of time and also the amount of time that was spent within each individual component that was involved in these transactions. So if I go down here, you'll see these different pie charts represent servers, resource manager types, applications, resource managers. And by clicking in the white portion of any of these pie charts, I can blow them up and see them in a larger view to get a better perspective of just exactly what was going on during the execution of these transactions. Of course, the lowest level view is a view of all the resources involved in the transactions that constitute this transaction group. So if I look here at this pie chart, what I see is the WebSphere MQ resource was involved at 66% of the time of the execution of these transactions, specifically for 2 seconds within this 5-minute interval. Now, if I click directly on any portion of this pie chart, I will see the trace view of the transactions. Now, in the trace view, there's a number of panels that are worthy of mention. The top one shows me transaction details, and at the bottom portion of my screen, I see transaction flow diagram, transaction trace, and transaction milestone. Okay, let's look at the top view first, the transaction details. So here what we see is, in this portion, we're looking at the metrics for individual transactions. So we see the start date of each individual transaction within this portion of time. We're seeing the applications that were involved during this period of time. We're seeing the status. So here we're looking at all completed transactions. We're looking at the workload in milliseconds, and also the transaction duration, the elapsed time of transactions, also in milliseconds. And of course the number of operations. So each one of the transactions we're seeing here involved 34 individual operations. Now if I click on one of these lines up here in my transaction details panel, what we'll see in the bottom portion of our screen is a transaction flow diagram. Now that's a graphical representation of a selected transaction from the top portion of my screen here. And we can look at different views here. For example, we can look at views of applications. We can show containers to show us a slightly more detailed view of this transaction, so I can see where the transaction originated, where it went to. Here it went from WAS, application server, to a message broker, finally to a queue manager, which is the trade audit queue, governs the trade audit queue. And we can also see this from different points of view. Here we're looking at the application point of view. We can see it from the viewpoint of logical unit of work, which gives us a slightly different representation of that selected transaction. And we can also, if we needed to, look at a magnifying glass view, which allows us to move that view around a little bit. It makes it a little bit easier to look at, easier to see. Now, another view that we have down here in this panel is the transaction trace. Now, this is a table that lists every individual operation that was observed by the transaction probes, sorted by operation time. Now, actually, you can change the sort. You can also change, if you wanted to, the presentation of each one of these columns, if need be. And so what we're seeing here is the beginning time of each operation within the transaction, the operation name, its resource, its elapsed time, its message age, for example. And you'll note that we have a little tool here that looks like a hammer and a spanner that are crossed. It'll show us the actual message content. So here, for example, we're looking at an HTTP GET. Here we're looking at an SQL execution, so that's the JDBC call. Here we're looking at a JMS send, followed by an MQ put, which is paired with our JMS send. So each one of these columns contains information about, for example, the resource manager type, the resource manager, the application, session ID, identifier of the logical unit of work, and so forth. Now, another view that we have on this bottom panel is called the transaction milestone view. Now, you note there's different milestones here. I have actually 5 of these that are being shown. 5 of these. Now, what milestones are? These are specific steps within a transaction trace that are significant to business users. So the way that you set them up is actually very simple. By looking at the overall transaction trace here, you can select different points simply by clicking on them, and you'll establish a name for the milestone and also a display name. Now, I'm going to cancel that. So once you've done that, you establish a certain number of milestones that have these names and their display names. And by using our administration tab, which I'll click on here, and I will select that group name, that trade verification group name, you can work with the order of presentation of these milestones. You can define whether or not they are required, in which order they follow. For example, here I have a starting point, which is the trade verification web app. I have an endpoint, which is the trade verification posted. This will be the name of the milestone, and each one of the individual steps in between. And as you'll note here, I can establish an SLA for each one of these milestones, as well as an SLA for the overall transactions of the overall transaction group. So within the trade verification group, which is selected by this application, so any transaction that involves an application called trade verification enrichment will automatically be defined as belonging to the trade verification group. I have defined an overall SLA of 3 seconds and also a certain number of milestones that are shown here, which each have their own individual SLA of 1 second, and we can define these down to the millisecond level. So if I go back now to the trace view that we have open, you'll see each one of these milestones that are shown here, and these milestones can also be shown through our transaction flow diagram. So one of the selections beyond application, session, resource, logical unit of work, and so forth is milestone. So here we're looking at each one of these milestones with their performance against the defined SLA. And if we choose here, if we look at it on our left panel, we're looking at completed transactions. We can also look at those which have failed or which missed their SLA. And by doing that, we'll click on search again. And we'll see that for a transaction that missed its SLA, we identify immediately which significant stage of the transaction was involved in that SLA breach. So here we see our audit step, for example, was involved in that SLA breach. So TransactionWorks Explorer, as you'll note here, contains a certain number of tabs with a variety of different views. For example, if we look at our profiler view, we see the application call metrics for each operation that was involved within this transaction. So, for example, here we see all the call operations, the close, the opens, the receives, and so forth. And we identify immediately within the MQ get grouping, specifically the trade validation input queue and the trade validation output queue was involved in 42.26% of usage, notably in instances where this transaction breached its SLA. So there are other views that we could look at. For example, our top charts view shows us a number of graphs that illustrate the top transaction groups according to diverse criteria. For example, here we could look at top transactions by volume, by duration. For example, this will change our view here. We could look at them by percent of missed SLA. So, for example, here we'll be looking at each transaction group, and we'll be looking at the percent of those transactions which missed their SLA. Now I'm just going to go back a second and show you within the AutoPilot M6 Enterprise Manager. Here we're looking at our last business view that grouped our transactions according to transaction groups. If we look here at our expert, the transaction analyzer expert, one of the things that we'll note by looking at the facts that are seen by this expert is the transaction stats, fact grouping, and the transaction group. So here you'll note that we have our transaction trade verification transaction group, and within that we see, for example, the average duration in milliseconds that was found by the transaction probes for the transactions that constitute that transaction group, and we also note the SLA, pardon me, in milliseconds, which is 3,000 milliseconds or 3 seconds, that we established using the administration tab of the AutoPilot TransactionWorks Explorer. So these metrics, these facts, are what we used to create our top-level view, which showed us how well our transactions within these different transaction groups are performing according to our established SLAs. Thanks very much.